Welcome back to another lesson with me, Mr. B. Today, we're going to look at the final for this unit, a personal narrative and deep dive analysis of an event with the critical concepts that we've learned from this unit. So if you head over to Google Classroom, remember to go over to the classwork tab and you'll find the unit final project handout. So a personal narrative. This narrative is going to be about a life event where you discovered a truth about yourself, your family, your community, or your education through the critical lenses and concepts that we've learned. So what does this mean, and why are we writing these stories? By writing these stories, we are reflecting on our lives individually and collectively. We learn and grow. By telling our stories, we can resist stereotypes, preserve our cultures and histories, and when we speak our truth, we begin to free ourselves. So the purpose here is to choose a life event, whether current, personal, global, political, a childhood memory, milestone, accomplishment, maybe even trauma if that's something you want to write about. Then briefly write about it and analyze how you see the concepts we've learned present in that event. As you've seen in the mastery check or student examples, you can write about anything so long as you reference one of these critical lenses and two of these critical concepts in your analysis. Let's take a look at the options that you have for this project. Use the timestamps on YouTube to skip around to the one you want to hear in detail or fast forward to. For starters, every student is going to be required to submit a narrative piece describing the current or life event you choose to analyze. And each narrative will include the following: briefly introduce, tell a story, or describe the event that you want to analyze in your life. It could also be related to the outside world. As I mentioned earlier, a state, national, or world event, political event, anything outside of yourself that you think is worth thinking or writing about. Then define in your own words the two critical concepts and one lens you plan to analyze with your narrative. So everybody has to have a narrative piece. Let's take a look at the different options that you can choose for this project, beginning with option A. So again, it must include a narrative, and you could rewind or look at the required for all options section right above. If you decide on option A, you will write a paper. Your introduction will be the narrative itself, and following the narrative, you're going to analyze it with 2 body paragraphs. You can choose which order you want the paragraphs to be in, as long as one paragraph analyzes your life event with a critical lens, and the other one analyzes it with 2 critical concepts. Just to be clear, you're not limited to one life event if the critical lenses and concepts don't relate to one another, or the single event that you chose. Then you're going to explain what you notice or what questions emerge as you apply these concepts. What do these concepts help you see or understand? And be specific. This is basically your evidence and where you draw the connections for your reader of how these lenses and concepts are present in your story. And to wrap that all up, you'll have a reflection. Your reflection is basically the conclusion of your paper, and it's going to tie all the ideas and analysis together, where you'll explain why reading or viewing the world with these concepts is important, and how this connects to your life or what you've learned from reading with a critical lens and just applying these concepts overall. So that's option A. And with option A, you do have to properly format it. Make sure you have your proper heading, title, double space, Times New Roman 12-point font, and if necessary, include a bibliography of the resources you've used, especially if you're referring to some sort of current event or article. Let's say if you're talking about the 2020 insurrection and you reference like a CNN article, make sure you cite that properly in your bibliography. Right below option A, you'll find the essay rubric that you'll be evaluated with. Use this rubric to make sure that you're at least meeting the standards of what's expected of you. In your introduction, make sure that you're summarizing the life event for your reader and explaining the purpose and importance of that event, and that you've defined your incorporated critical concepts and lenses. In your body paragraph, you need to make sure that you have those 2 critical concepts and one lens to at least get passing credit or meet the standard of this unit final, and explain how these concepts are present or used to look at this life event. Then lastly, again, in your conclusion, explain why reading and understanding the chosen lenses or concepts that you've used is important, and draw those connections again for your reader and what you've learned from applying them in this narrative. So over on page 3, you're going to find option B, which is a presentation or instructional video like this one, or just a video in general. Again, you must include a narrative piece submitted with the other files. In this option, you're going to create a presentation that combines and organizes your events and critical concepts. You can form a group and create a slide deck presentation, minimum of 2 people, no more than 5. And when it comes to choosing between a video or a presentation, the only difference with the video is that you're going to have to record, edit, and upload your video to Google Classroom or YouTube, whatever you prefer. And for the video, the only thing that you would present is introducing the video during class and pressing play, then some final thoughts to end off on a high note. When it comes to the presentation or the content that you're including in the video, just like the mastery check, you're gonna need to have a title slide. So make sure you have your name, title, images or GIFs as necessary. Then you're gonna have another slide that explains the event. At least one person should have their event. That's why it says minimum one slide. But a tip here is to break up the information into multiple slides, because you do not want to have a paragraph that has a bunch of text on one slide. Use the information that you wrote from your narrative to help facilitate and form this presentation. Include some historical context. So you want to summarize the event because no one's read your narrative. So if it's a personal event, like a childhood story or something, you may not need to answer the next two questions, but you want to include some important dates, events, or information that took place that your audience may need to know. What were some of the main ideologies or philosophies of this movement, event, or story that you're telling your audience? And then lastly, you're going to have a concluding slide. You want to tell the audience why it's important that your group recognizes the influence of these events on your own life or the world around you, and leave the audience with something that you want them to take away from your presentation. How would you wrap that up in one final sentence? And this doesn't have to be one person. This could be each of you kind of sharing what your final thoughts and takeaways that you want the audience to remember as you wrap up your presentation. Then thank the audience for their time. Just like option A, there's a rubric right below, the presentation rubric. Similarly, you want to meet the standards. So make sure that you're summarizing the life event for the reader, you're explaining the purpose and importance of the event, defining any critical concepts, analyzing it with two concepts and one lens, and explaining how all these things are connected. In the presentation itself, you want to make sure that you're loud enough to be heard by all audience members, that you're relaxed, you're pacing, you're speaking, and you're in your most natural voice if possible, which is more moving towards mastery, but try to be relaxed and make sure that you practice your slides in front of a mirror or something so that you can engage your audience as you're sharing this important narrative from you to them. When it comes to presenting, make sure you're making eye contact. You're not just reading off the slides that are behind you, and you're standing up straight or moving when necessary if you have to point at something on the projector screen, or that you're talking to the audience, or you're making hand motions, or whatever works best for you. Do your best to only make movements when necessary, but also try to be presentable. Don't be like leaning against the whiteboard waiting for your turn and you're like, all right, it's my turn, let me speak. So the last option, C, is a podcast. Again, you must include a narrative submitted with your other files, in this case an MP3 file or something. And with this, you're going to record a discussion or make a podcast between you and your group mates on the events and concepts you chose. Minimum of 2 people, no more than 5. Right below is an outline for you to design the structure of your podcast. So you need to have an introduction. Include your names, what you're going to discuss, give a brief overview before you and your group mates start talking. I put an example over here of how I would open my podcast. It might be something like, welcome to the Wine Thursday podcast, where all of us will be drinking some wine and all definitely talking some shit. I'm one of your hosts, Avery, and we have person 1, 2, and 3, or they introduce themselves. And today we're going to be talking about some current events or life stories that have changed how we see ourselves in the world today. And then after that, just like the presentation, have some sort of historical context. When you're talking about your event, summarize it, because no one knows what it is that you're sharing, right? And include, again, any important events, ideologies, or information that your listeners need to know. Then you need to have your critical concepts somewhere in this discussion. And we must hear from every person of how they've made connections or what analysis that they've done to evaluate the story that they've written about. Though it might feel repetitive, try to build off one another. So maybe you can make an outline, and to make sure you're not all saying the same thing, or that you kind of know the order of which people are going to talk, but you also don't want it to sound so formulaic. You kind of want it to sound like a natural discussion, which most podcasts are. With the critical concepts, you don't have to define the concepts in an explicit section, like, now we're going to explain the critical concepts that we're talking about. You don't have to do that. As much as possible, try to keep it natural, but if you realize that one of your group members doesn't address the concepts or lenses that they're using, you could have something kind of like this. Yeah, I agree. The pandemic really affected my mental health and a lot of my friends too. If you had to connect that stuff that we learned in this unit, what concepts did you see reflected when you thought about using the pandemic for your narrative? You can create prompting questions like that, or you can all just kind of agree, cut it out in editing, in post, make it sound a little bit more natural, but maybe make cues or something to signal one of your friends that, hey, you forgot to talk about this. Make sure to include it. And then lastly, you're going to have your outro. And just like the other 2 conclusions in the previous options, you want to talk about why do you think it's so important to look back and reflect on events like these? And why do you think it's so important to draw connections between the concepts we've learned in class and the world around you? Then have an outro, sign off and thank your listeners for tuning in. There is a podcast rubric below, very similar to the presentation one. Again, you want to be in the meet standards section, and you're going to be summarizing the life events for your readers. Make sure that's very clear, explaining the purpose and importance of these events that you decided to talk about, defining the concepts that you decided to include. And when you're speaking on a podcast, though you're not presenting and projecting into a room, you want to make sure that your volume is loud enough to be heard by your audience members. Sometimes in these own videos of mine, especially the earlier ones, I'm definitely speaking a lot quieter. It took a while for me to get comfortable in front of the microphone and the camera. And you want to speak with your natural voice. You don't really want to sound like you're reading off of your outline or the script that you all put together. You want to seem relaxed and having fun with this. So, try to sound relaxed and comfortable. Maybe you have to do more than one take. Maybe you need to re-record. Whatever it is, try to get loose and be comfortable. Another thing is make sure that one person speaks at a time. If you're really into it or you're kind of moving towards mastery, you might naturally bounce off of one another, especially if you're doing a project with your friends. You might feel a lot more comfortable than kind of, all right, now it's Jason's turn. Now it's this person's turn. And then again, with your conclusion and outro, you could even just have a section on a concluding statement that you want to leave your readers thinking with from the story or narrative that you shared specifically, so that you can end on a high note and then close out the podcast. All right, I hope that the overview of this unit final was thorough and clear. If you have any questions, feedback, comment, or concerns, please let me know and I'll alter this as necessary. All right, I'll see you in the next one. Peace.